The coffee mug slipped from my hand when I read the notification on my phone. Not because I was startled, because my hands were shaking. It was the Chase app. A charge of $40847 on the joint account my son-in-law and I shared for household expenses. The merchant name, Expedia. The timestamp, 11:43 p.m., the night before Thanksgiving. I stood in my kitchen. My kitchen, the one I'd refinished twice, the one where I'd taught my daughter to make pie crust from scratch. And I read that number 4 times. Then I sat down on the floor. Not because my legs gave out, because I needed a moment to decide what kind of man I was still going to be. Let me back up. My name is Bernard. I'm 63 years old. I retired 2 years ago after 31 years as a structural engineer outside of Columbus, Ohio. My wife, Patricia, passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago, and after she went, the house got very quiet in a way I hadn't prepared for. We'd raised one child together, our daughter, Melissa. She was the kind of kid who left thank you notes on the kitchen counter, who called on random Tuesdays just to say she was thinking of us. Patricia always said Melissa got her warmth. I think she was right. Melissa met her husband, my son-in-law, at a work conference in Charlotte about 5 years ago. He was in sales, still is, and the first time I shook his hand, I noticed he had the grip of someone who'd been coached to have a firm handshake, not the grip of someone who dangerously trusted people. I filed that away. I'm an engineer. I notice structural things. They got married quickly, moved back to Columbus, so Melissa could be closer to me after her mother died. That part was her idea. She told me so herself. And I believed her because I know my daughter. They rented an apartment on the east side and things were fine for about a year. Then my son-in-law lost his job. It happened fast, the way those things do. His company restructured, his whole department was cut, and suddenly he was home full-time sending out LinkedIn connection requests and wearing the same gray sweatshirt for 4 days straight. Melissa was working as a nurse practitioner at Ohio Health and carrying the health insurance for both of them. I watched her get tired in a way that reminded me too much of her mother in the last year. I offered to help. That's what you do. That's what Patricia would have done. I had the space, a 4-bedroom colonial I'd paid off in 2019, and I had savings from 3 decades of disciplined living. I told them they could stay with me, rent-free, while my son-in-law got back on his feet. No timeline pressure, just family helping family. They moved in on a Saturday in March. I remember because there was a late-season snow and I helped carry boxes in from the truck while my son-in-law directed traffic from under the covered porch. The first few months were manageable. My son-in-law was applying for jobs, or said he was. Melissa and I cooked dinner together a few nights a week. I'd come home from the hardware store or a walk and find her sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, and she'd look up and smile, and for a moment it felt like the house was full again, the way it used to be. Then things shifted. It started small, the way erosion starts small. My son-in-law began referring to the house as our place in conversation. Not maliciously, or at least I told myself that. Just casually. Back at our place. When we get home. I mentioned it once, lightly, and he laughed it off. So I let it go. He got a new sales job in the fall. Regional manager for a medical device company. Good salary. I was genuinely happy for him. I thought the stay would wrap up soon. Maybe by the new year, maybe by spring at the latest. I started mentally planning how I'd redecorate the guest room. But spring came and they were still there. I brought it up with Melissa gently and she said they were saving for a down payment. That made sense. Columbus real estate had gotten aggressive. I said okay, I could be patient. What I didn't know, what I found out later, was that my son-in-law had opened a joint account with me under the pretense of sharing household expenses fairly. He'd suggested it 6 months in, framed it as him wanting to contribute. I thought it was a gesture of goodwill, and I added him to one of my secondary checking accounts. He put in $400 a month. He used it like a personal card. I'd look at the statements occasionally and see charges I didn't recognize. A golf outing. Tickets to a Clippers game in LA when he was supposedly at a sales conference. A recurring charge to a cigar subscription box. I asked about a few of them early on and always got explanations. Client entertainment. Work reimbursement pending. A gift for a colleague. I'm not stupid. But I was willing to give benefit of the doubt to the man my daughter loved. That was my mistake. To Thanksgiving before the one that broke everything open, his parents drove up from Lexington and stayed for 4 days. His father took my armchair in the living room every evening without asking. His mother reorganized my pantry on day 2 and left a sticky note on the shelf that said, "I put the canned goods in date order, you're welcome." I smiled and said nothing because I was raised by a man who believed a guest in your home deserved patience, even when they were testing it. My son-in-law grilled on my back deck that Thursday. His own family Thanksgiving, in my house, on my grill, with groceries I'd gone to Kroger at 7 a.m. to buy because he'd forgotten. At dinner, he sat at the head of the table. My table, the one Patricia and I had bought at an estate sale in 2003 and refinished together one summer weekend. He sat there like he'd always sat there, like the table had always been his, like the whole room had always been his. I sat at the side. I told myself it didn't matter. Seating arrangements. I'm 63 years old, and I know how to pick my battles. I told myself that. What I couldn't tell myself, and what I lay awake thinking about that night, was whether my daughter saw it, whether she noticed, whether she felt the same quiet wrongness I did, and just didn't know what to do with it. I hope she did. I was afraid she didn't. The following months were a long lesson in paying attention. I started writing things down, not in a dramatic way. I'm not a dramatic man. I have a yellow legal pad I keep in my desk drawer, and I started noting dates and amounts. The $400 contributions that came in every month, while the account consistently drained at twice that rate. The week in February when my son-in-law's truck needed a new transmission and $2,300 came out of the shared account with no discussion. The streaming services added in his name. The Amazon deliveries, some addressed to him, some not addressed to anyone, just left on the porch. I also called my bank. First National in Westerville, where I'd banked for 22 years. I talked to a woman named Linda who'd helped me set up my accounts after Patricia died. I told her I needed to understand exactly what access my son-in-law had, and what I could and couldn't do unilaterally. She walked me through everything, and then she said something I didn't expect. "Bernard, it might be worth talking to an attorney before you make any changes, just to protect yourself." I thanked her and hung up and sat with that for a day. Then I called a lawyer, a real estate attorney named Paul, who'd helped me with my property taxes a few years back. I made an appointment and drove downtown on a Tuesday morning and laid everything out. The yellow legal pad. The bank statements I'd printed at home and organized by month, the pattern I'd observed over 18 months. Paul listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he looked at the papers and said, "How long have they been living there?" 22 months, I said. He nodded slowly. "Okay, in Ohio, once someone has lived in a property for 30 days or more, they have tenant rights regardless of whether rent has been paid or a lease signed. You'd need to provide formal written notice and follow the statutory process." "How long would that take?" "Minimum 60 days from notice, provided they don't contest it." I asked him to explain the whole process. He did. I took notes in the margin of my legal pad. When he finished, I asked him to draft the notice documents whenever I was ready to initiate. I drove home thinking about Melissa. That was the part that kept stopping me. Not my son-in-law. I'd stopped worrying about hurting his feelings sometime around the transmission incident. It was my daughter. She was the one I promised her mother I'd always take care of. She was the one who'd moved back to Columbus for me. I didn't want her to feel like I was choosing the house over her. I called her that evening, just to talk. We ended up on the phone for almost an hour. She told me she was tired. She said it in that careful way she has. The nurse practitioner voice. The one where she's reporting symptoms without diagnosing. She was tired of working 50-hour weeks while her husband networked. Tired of feeling like she was managing 2 households inside one. She didn't say anything specific about me or about the house. But I heard what she wasn't saying. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether she and her husband had been saving seriously. She paused. "Dad, he keeps saying we are, but I haven't seen the account statements in a while." That pause did something to me. I didn't say anything then. I just said I loved her and I'd see her Thursday for dinner. Then I called Paul back and told him to finalize the notice. Now we come to the Expedia charge. It was 2 days before Thanksgiving. My son-in-law had mentioned at dinner the previous week that he'd been invited to a team retreat the week after the holiday. I'd made small conversation about it, asked if it was local. He said no, Phoenix. I said that sounded nice. What the Chase notification told me at 11:43 p.m. was that he'd bought 4 plane tickets. Columbus to Phoenix. Round trip. Departing December 2nd. 4 tickets. There are only 2 people in my son-in-law's immediate family who live locally, himself and my daughter. 4 tickets meant his parents from Lexington were coming. 4 tickets, $4,847, on an account that had my name on it. He had not mentioned us to me, not once. I sat on the kitchen floor with my phone in my hand for a long time. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard was bare, and the yard looked the way it always looks in late November, stripped down to what it actually is. I thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would say. I think she would have said, "Bernard, you have been patient long enough." I went upstairs and I slept. Surprisingly well, actually. Thanksgiving morning, I was up at 5. I made the turkey brine the way I always have. Kosher salt, brown sugar, orange peel, a bay leaf. And I had it in the pot by 6. My son-in-law's parents arrived at noon. His mother brought a casserole dish covered in foil and set it on my stove like she was contributing to a potluck. His father walked in without taking off his boots. At 4 o'clock, we sat down to eat. My son-in-law gestured toward the chair at the head of the table, Patricia's old chair, the one I always sit in, and looked at me and said, "Hey, would you mind sitting over there today? Dad's back has been acting up and he needs the armrest." I looked at him. I looked at the chair. I looked at his father, who was standing with his hands in his pockets and hadn't said a word. I said, "Of course," and I moved. Melissa was in the kitchen getting the green bean casserole. She didn't see it happen. I was grateful for that and ashamed of that gratitude in equal measure. Dinner was fine, the way things are fine when everyone is pretending. His mother talked about a renovation they were doing in Lexington. His father complimented the turkey and didn't ask who had brined it. My son-in-law refilled his own glass 3 times and mine once. Melissa sat next to me and put her hand on my arm at one point, and I wondered if she was apologizing for something she hadn't said out loud. After his parents left and Melissa went upstairs, my son-in-law sat down in the living room with a bourbon. He looked relaxed in the way that people look relaxed when they think everything is fine. I sat across from him and said, "I saw the Expedia charge." He didn't flinch. "That was interesting." He said, "Oh, that. I was going to mention it. The company's covering most of it. I'll reimburse the account." I said there were 4 tickets. He picked up his glass. "Melissa's coming too. Family bonuses." "And your parents?" A pause. "They wanted to see Phoenix. It made sense to bundle it." I said, "On my account." He said, "It's a shared account, Bernard." I looked at him for a moment. "It's my account that I added you to for household expenses. 4 plane tickets to Phoenix for a vacation that you didn't discuss with me is not a household expense." He set down his glass. His tone shifted, not loud, but cooler. "Look, I'm going to reimburse it. I don't know why you're making this a big deal." I said, "I'm not making anything a big deal. I'm telling you what I've decided." He waited. "I've already spoken to an attorney. You and Melissa have 60 days from written notice to find alternate housing. I'm sending the formal notice by certified mail on Monday, which means your deadline is January 27th. I've also removed you from the bank account effective today." He stared at me. I stood up. "The account is mine. The house is mine. I want you both to have time to find something good, and 60 days should be enough for a couple with 2 incomes and presumably some savings. Good night." I went upstairs. I could hear him downstairs for another hour. On the phone, I think, keeping his voice low. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not even satisfaction, not really, mostly just tiredness, and under the tiredness something quieter. Relief. Monday, I drove to the post office on Morse Road and sent the certified letter myself. The next few weeks were the hardest of the whole thing. Not because my son-in-law caused problems. He went cold and strategic, which I'd expected. But because of Melissa, she came to me 2 days after Thanksgiving, sat down at the kitchen island, and cried in a way I hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. She said, "Dad, why couldn't you just talk to us?" I told her I had been talking for 22 months in the ways I knew how. I told her about the legal pad. I showed her some of it, the charges, the dates. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that told me everything I needed to know. She said, I didn't know about the Phoenix tickets. She hadn't known. He'd booked 4 tickets on a shared account she didn't even know had her father's name on it, and he hadn't told her. I reached across the island and took her hand and said, I know. That's why I'm doing this. She cried again, different tears that time. Melissa and her husband found an apartment in Clintonville by mid-January. She told me they signed a lease for 12 months, which I think was her way of building in some space to figure things out. I helped her move some of her things. Her husband didn't speak to me that day. I didn't mind. The morning of January 28th, one day past the deadline, I woke up early and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. My kitchen, my table, Patricia's chair. The oak in the backyard had maybe an inch of snow on the branches, and the yard looked clean in the way it only looks after fresh snow, when everything is covered and the edges are soft. My phone showed 41 missed calls from my son-in-law's number, all from the night before. I hadn't heard them. I'd slept with the phone on silent, and I'd slept well. I put the phone face down on the table. I thought about kindness. I'd been kind for 22 months. I'd cooked Thanksgiving dinner with a brine I'd been making for 30 years, and I'd moved out of my chair when asked. And I'd watched someone else sit at the head of my table and call my house their place. I wasn't angry at myself for being kind. I don't regret it. But somewhere along the way, I'd let kindness become a habit of silence, and silence became permission, and permission became normal. Patricia used to say that you teach people how to treat you. She said it about hospital administrators, about contractors, about neighbors. She never had to say it to me about myself. I think she assumed I already knew. I'm learning it now, at 63, on a January morning with snow on the oak tree, and a kitchen that smells like coffee and is exactly as quiet as I want it to be. There's a second bedroom upstairs that I've started clearing out. Not for guests. For a woodworking studio. I bought a lathe in November and it's been sitting in the garage under a tarp because there was no room for it. Pretty soon, there will be. Some things take longer than they should to find their proper place. That's all right. They get there. I've been thinking about the word patient a lot lately. For most of my life, I thought patience was a virtue, and I still do, mostly. But somewhere in those 22 months, I confused patience with permission. I let things slide because I told myself I was being the bigger person. What I was actually doing was making it easier for someone to keep taking. That's not a comfortable thing to admit at 63. My son-in-law didn't become who he was overnight. Looking back now, I can trace it. The small things that went unchallenged, one after another, each one slightly larger than the last. The boots left on by the front door. The account charges with easy explanations, the chair at the head of my own table. None of those moments broke anything on their own. But together they built something, and what they built was a version of my home where I was a guest and he was the resident. That happened because I allowed it to happen, slowly in the name of keeping the peace. I don't say that to punish myself. I say it because I think it's true, and because the truth is the only place I know how to start. What finally moved me wasn't anger, it was clarity. The night I saw that Expedia charged 4 tickets, nearly $5,000, a vacation I hadn't been told about, something settled in me rather than erupted. I'd been carrying a slow accumulation of small wrongs for almost 2 years, and in that moment I simply stopped adding to the pile. I got up off the kitchen floor, I went to bed, and I slept. That's when I knew I'd already made my decision, even before I'd said a word to anyone. There's something to be said for doing the hard work quietly. I didn't confront anyone at Thanksgiving dinner. I didn't make a scene, didn't raise my voice. Didn't send an angry text at midnight. I drove to my attorney's office on a Tuesday morning with a legal pad and organized bank statements, and I asked questions and took notes. That kind of response requires something different than just being angry. It requires having thought clearly enough, long enough, to know what you actually want and what it's going to take to get there. That kind of thinking doesn't happen when you're reacting. It happens when you've been paying attention. The hardest part was Melissa. It was always going to be Melissa. She is my daughter, and I would walk through fire for her, and for a long time I told myself that staying quiet was the same thing as protecting her. It wasn't. The morning she sat at the kitchen island and told me she hadn't seen their savings account statements in months. That was the moment I understood that my silence hadn't protected her at all. It had just left her alone with someone who wasn't being straight with her. Standing up for yourself is not the same as giving up on the people you love. Sometimes it's the only honest thing left to do for them. I think about Patricia when I sit at the kitchen table now. She would have seen through my son-in-law much earlier than I did. She had that kind of intelligence about people, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. She also would have known when to stop waiting. She taught me a lot, and I'm still catching up. The lathe is in the studio now. The snow is off the oak tree. Some mornings I get up at 5 and the house is exactly as quiet as I want it to be, and I make coffee and I sit at my own table in my own chair and I think, this is what I was working toward. Not revenge. Just this.